It is finally here. I know I'm a little bit late to the punch, but I had to give it a good amount of hours before I could give it an honest review. I'm Sam the Ashen, and this is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is a medieval action RPG released on February 4th this year. It's got pretty solid ratings all around, which is definitely leagues above the initial reception of the first Kingdom Come Deliverance. The first game was plagued with bugs and frame rate issues, especially for PC players, but they seem to have took that into consideration much more this time around because the release has been going pretty smoothly by all accounts. The real name of the game here is realism. I played the first game all the way through a couple of times, and without a doubt, the thing that stood out to me from every other game that I had played before was the realism. And that realism, for better or for worse, has been centered right at the core of Kingdom Come 2. You might try to charm someone into agreeing with you, but you just fought bandits, got thrown off pebbles, and rolled around in the dirt, and now you stink and you're covered in mud. Well, now they're going to think you're just a vagrant and totally dismiss you. Your solution is to either wash off in a water trowel, or if you want to get all the way clean, you have to go to a bathhouse and get a proper cleaning. Maybe you find yourself in a sword fight. You can't just button mash your way to victory. There are different directional inputs that you want to target depending on how your opponent's stance is or what combo you want to pull off. Maybe you fought a dozen bandits over the course of your journey. Well, now your beautiful sword is kind of chipped and dull. It's not as effective, it's weaker, and eventually it'll lower its overall quality. The solution once again here lies in the realism for almost everything. You can take your sword to a grindstone and sharpen the blade back up yourself, or you can take it to a blacksmith and have them repair it. I think it's pretty easy to at least see where people are coming from when they say that they don't want to deal with the realism. The whole point of playing games is to get immersed into something unrealistic. And I get that, it's not for everybody. But on the flip side, the realism adds depth. It adds immersion. It adds difficulty. It adds stakes to what could otherwise be completely straightforward and overly simple. I love the realism that this game has ingrained into its world. The feeling of satisfaction from forging my own medieval sword or brewing my own healing potions from herbs that I went out and picked in the forest, or seeking out a skilled swordsman to learn a new technique for battle, all of these things come together to create what truly feels like a living world. I've had my fair share of complaints about games with dead worlds and how their shallow mask slips off to reveal the bones of a game that didn't need more time in the oven, but more love and passion to bring the world to life. Thankfully, for all of us, this is not the case for Kingdom Come 2, because Bohemia is alive and well. I want to go ahead and talk about the combat, especially because after all the kinks were ironed out of the first game, the main complaints, that I heard at least, were about how bad the combat was. Whether it was too difficult, too complicated, or just plain bad, it was definitely divisive. The combat in Kingdom Come 2 is slightly simplified, with one less directional input overall, and pretty much shorter combos for the most part. But with the last game possibly being too complicated, it also got too simplified in mid to late game, with something called the Master Strike. It was basically a parry with a really generous window, and it would single-handedly win you most fights. I think to try to rectify this problem in the sequel, they slightly simplified the early game combat and tried to keep the mid to late game combat interesting by making the Master Strike harder to pull off. Instead of just pressing a button at the right time, you also have to have your stance the opposite of your opponent's. If an opponent attacks from the left, you have to perfect attack from the right, attack from above, then perfect attack from below, and so on. I think this is a good solution, especially because enemies do a pretty good job of switching stances and attacking as to make fights more dynamic and challenging. Early game bandits are pretty fair. They're usually just lightly armored and have pretty mediocre weapons, so that the fights feel fair and you can't get really overpowered right away, at least not from the bandits. I personally was a fan of the first game's story. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, but it was a nice revenge story that was easy to keep up with some nice twists and turns along the way. It might have ended in kind of a cliffhanger, but obviously they had planned the sequel. The sequel follows the story from the first game, and it picks up pretty quickly, with some slow spots in between for you to explore the world, indulge in some side quests, and just to get lost and enjoy the world, which is a great time. Some of the enjoyment of the story definitely depends on whether or not you played the first game. Don't get me wrong, the game is totally fine as a standalone if this is your first time playing Kingdom Come, but it will no doubt be more enjoyable if you already have some kind of attachment to the main characters. I think for most of the things in this section, the verdict is going to be subjective, but in my opinion, the characters are very well written, their actions are usually pretty believable, things tend to just make sense for the most part, the writing is really good, the banter between characters, especially Henry and Hans, but definitely not limited to them, is really good. I smiled or laughed countless times throughout the game, whether it was from tricking a guard into thinking I'm deaf so he wouldn't arrest me.
Get out of here! Let's just forget about this!
I don't need to piss, I just went.
Clear off!
Or telling Hans that he was acting like a spoiled brat. There were plenty of tense moments that had me fully locked in, several deep, meaningful moments, and a lot more. Obviously, I can't really talk about or show the intense moments without getting into spoilers, so you'll just have to see them for yourself. There was one moment in the story where a kind of important decision is made by Henry, and I thought, that's kind of weird that these are my only two options. But I also could have just been looking for the perfect outcome, and the game tries to paint a world of gray, not black and white. The story is great. Once again, it's not groundbreaking, but it's not a chore or anything just tacked on either. As far as customization goes, there is a lot to get your hands on. Although you can't change Henry's hairstyle like you could in the first one, which I was disappointed by. I could be wrong, there might be a way, but I have not seen it. The game does make up for it by having over a dozen armor and clothing slots, with everything from a necklace to belts to spurs. You can really kit yourself out in your own way. Some of the designs of clothes or armor are pretty fugly looking, but there's also some really nice looking pieces. Usually the price corresponds well with the style, which makes sense. There's also surprisingly a solid amount of build options with multiple tabs of stats to individually level up and a dozen or more perks of each of those categories. Leveling up these skills and taking Henry from just a pretty solid guy to a silver-tongued stud that could sell a monk his own rosary that you just lifted out of his pouch, while also being able to take down 3 plate armor guards with no shield, is pretty satisfying. While there is a ton of stats and perks to make your own build, I have a feeling that there will be a best or meta build, at least for combat. This is in large part due to the Master Strike only being able to be performed by using a sword, which kinda makes every other weapon type subpar. I'm not sure about this decision, but luckily swords, both one-handed and two-handed, are a lot of fun to use. There's a good amount of combos to mix up what you can try in battle too. I guess most of the customization comes in with your decisions in the game. Certain choices will initiate certain outcomes and consequences, while also affecting how people see Henry. There's an entire reputation system that ties into the dialogue you'll get with people, the prices they'll charge you for their goods, how willing they are to agree with you or help you out, and stuff like that. I think maybe the only improvement I could think to make here would be that the reputation reaction from people would be less predictable. Usually it feels like being agreeable and sometimes even a suck up gets you a boost in reputation, and only rarely do you get surprised and get a reputation boost because you stood up to somebody or called someone out and someone else in the conversation respects that about Henry. There were a small handful of these moments that I noticed, which were great. I just think the game could have benefited more from stuff like this. There's plenty of things worth mentioning, but for now, there is blacksmithing, which makes sense because originally you're the son of a blacksmith. And the blacksmithing minigame is pretty in-depth. I could see some people really enjoying it, and I could also see some people not caring for it at all. Luckily, it's not mandatory. You won't have to mess with it if you don't want to. There's also herbalism and alchemy, where you can pick your own flowers and then brew them into potions. The alchemy is also really in-depth, and the same thing can be said here. People will either love it, or they might not care for it at all. Right now, the only way to manually save is to exit the game, or drink a potion that's called Save Your Schnapps. So, alchemy could be a bit more mandatory than blacksmithing. I actually enjoyed the alchemy minigame, so I brewed plenty of these potions early on, but I also didn't find myself needing to use them very often unless I was trying to get up to some thievery. Typically, saving and quitting would do the trick. Speaking of thievery, it's probably the quickest way to get ahead. It also comes with the risk of getting caught, which involves paying a fine and returning everything you stole and losing reputation. If it's something more serious, like murder, you'll be branded, and then, as the game warns you, if you do something serious again, instead of getting branded again, you'll just get executed. I will admit that sneaking into expensive shops in the middle of the night and then finding the loot chest with all their goods and money was really intense and provided some nice risk and reward. I remember a certain part in the story where I decided to get revenge by robbing an entire castle down to the golden cups that they drank their fancy wine in, and it was pretty satisfying. If you decide to do any thievery or anything else really, you'll be introduced to the AI. The game warns you ahead of time, but you'll learn pretty quickly that they've pretty much stepped up their game from the last one. If you're in or near someone's house, they will immediately suspect something is up, and if you don't leave, they will call the guards to come question you. If you pickpocket keys from someone, they will eventually notice this, and after a few days, they'll change the locks. If you break into a shop and rob a chest, they'll eventually notice things are missing and they'll report it. And if anyone witnessed you near the shop, you'll be one of the prime suspects. The AI is pretty solid all around. I haven't had any laughably bad moments. Their pathing seems to be pretty good along with everything else. Competent AI is definitely a key element to make the world feel alive. As far as progression goes, there's really two major things: gear, and level. While there are some really good perks that help everything from melee damage and armor rating to being sneakier while drunk and everything in between, I think that gear makes a bigger difference, at least in combat. Having good plate armor and a decent weapon helps tremendously. While being naked with nothing but a sword, but you still have all your skills, you'll probably get two-shotted by most bandits. I don't have a problem with this at all because it seems like the most realistic route to take. The speech checks are a bit different, as gear affects charisma and your toughness or intimidation, and then speech is a stat that you have to work on throughout the game. So it feels pretty balanced as you move through. The only real problem I have with the progression is that the game seems to get too easy too fast, or rather Henry feels overpowered too fast. The game feels pretty brutal and the world feels super dangerous early on, but after the first few missions, when I had just some decent gear, I took on groups of 4 bandits several times without any problems. You could also say that it's more accessible all around. The game shouldn't be too difficult or else it'll push some of the audience away, but I would say that keeping the story mission difficulty the way it is perfect, and then making the enemies in the open world and side quests much more difficult would be the way to go. That way there is a reward for taking on harder challenges while not forcing anyone into it either. You also have a bunch of tools at your disposal, like stealth takedowns. You can poison a bandit camp's food so that they're sick and weak. You can shoot them with arrows from afar to even out the numbers. There are plenty of ways to get an advantage. But when you can just charge in and take on a whole bandit hideout by yourself, it kind of sucks out any incentive to just take advantage of any of these methods. Just to cap this off, it doesn't ruin the game or anything close to that. I just personally wish that the game was a bit more challenging for a longer time. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is an amazing game. It's incredibly immersive, the realism is really cool, and it really sucks you into this world that Warhorse Studios has made. The combat is fun and challenging without feeling unfair, if not too easy sometimes. The dialogue is fun to listen to, your responses available to you are mostly satisfying and believable, the characters are well written, the story is well done, and getting invested into it feels natural. The world feels alive, and it is such a good time to be a part of. One graphical problem that I did encounter was in a certain part in Trotsky, which is the city in the game. During rainstorms and thunderstorms, the screen would artifact and flicker up to a really high brightness off and on, but this is the only place that it happened and the only time that it happened. So it didn't really interfere with my game too much, and I'm sure they'll be pretty quick to fix this. If you are remotely interested in RPGs at all, I highly recommend Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 because it feels like one of a kind. I usually don't put a number on it, but just for the hell of it, to make it easier, I would say a 9 out of 10. Nothing's perfect, but Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 comes pretty close. I appreciate you watching the video. If you enjoyed it, leaving a like helps me out a lot. If you have any thoughts, let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. If you want to see more from me, subscribe. I'll post once every other week on Sunday, so I'll never clog up your feed. I hope you have a good one. Peace out.